I've got the 7 Cherokee clans listed: the wolf, deer, bird, longhair, wild potato, red paint, and blue. So when you're doing your Cherokee genealogy, you might keep that in mind, and if you figure out what clan you're in, that might help you a little bit in your research. So where I start out with is, I can't really pronounce it, but Kawaki, Sakashwiga, 5 killer, who was born 1710, died 1791, was married to Tame Doe. Born 1712, died 1760. They had a daughter, and LSU and Mary can pronounce her name. I mean, they called her Nancy, but what would the Cherokee pronunciation be?
Nanyehi, I believe.
I agree. Yeah.
Nanyehi. And so they just converted that to Nancy. She was born 1738, died 1822. She's better known as Nancy Ward. I don't know where that came from. Okay. In 1753, she married Kingfisher, who was born 1732, died 1755, a couple of years after they married. Kingfisher was in a battle against another Indian tribe, and he was killed in the battle. And when he was killed, I don't know if he was the leader of the group, but the others started to fall back and retreat, and Nancy picked up his gun or bow and arrows and started shooting back and rallied the troops, and they were victorious. And so she became a hero and famous with the Cherokees, and was allowed to sit in on the councils. Then, a year after that, she married Bryant Ward, who was a British Army officer. And they had, but anyway, with Kingfisher, she had a child, Katie, who went by Catherine. And Katie married in 1763 a fellow named Ellis Harlan, who was a Quaker from Pennsylvania. Now, let's stop a little bit. Does anybody have any questions about Nancy Ward and her story? Or any comments about that?
This is Steve Hampton. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes. I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, so I'm also a direct descendant of Nancy Ward. Trying to figure out how my path was, but I know that KT name too.
Well, probably the first thing you might check is, do you descend from her children that she had with Bryant Ward or with Kingfisher?
Oh, that's right. You're right. I remember that now. Yeah. Well, you go ahead. I'm busy looking this up on a side table.
Well, you might want to check it out. I mean, I'm going to go through my connection, but a lot of people could be related to Nancy Ward that would have been through her other husband, Bryant Ward.
So I'm through KT Kingfisher and John Walker.
Yeah, so we would be in that same line then, because Katie was the daughter of Kingfisher, not Bryant Ward.
Correct. Yeah.
And to back up a little bit and talk about Nancy Ward, is anybody familiar with dragging canoe?
Heard it. Familiar with the name. I don't know that I know the entire story.
Yeah, well, let me tell you a little bit about Dragging Canoe. Dragging Canoe was the first cousin of Nancy Ward. And he was the son of Attakulla, who was known as Little Carpenter, who was the principal chief of the Cherokees back then. Attakulla was the brother of Tame Doe, if you can kind of figure things out. So anyway, so Nancy Ward and Dragging Canoe were first cousins. Dragging Canoe got his name because they were getting ready to go on a war party, and he was a little kid, and he wanted to go, and his dad told him, there you go, son, as soon as you can get a canoe in the river, you can go. So this little kid grabbed a canoe and started trying to pull it and drag it into the river. He didn't get it in, but the other warriors laughed and it said Dragging Canoe, and that's how he got the name Dragging Canoe. But he and Nancy Ward took a little bit divergent paths. I mean, Nancy married a British Army officer, and Dragging Canoe was, always organizing Cherokees to fight the British and organize raiding parties. And they had a little conflict because Nancy would give away Dragging Canoe's battle plans from time to time to prevent it. And you can understand, being married to somebody in the British military, she had mixed sympathies. So that's a little bit about Nancy Ward and Dragging Canoe. If you're talking about Nancy Ward and you meet some ancestors of Dragging Canoe, they may not think so highly of Nancy. Yeah, they may think she's kind of a traitor. Others, she's been reputed pretty high in Cherokee history. She was called the beloved woman. She was one of the few women that could actually sit on the Red or the War Councils. And she had, powers of pardon as a member of the council. And there's some famous stories where there were some white women that had been taken captives that were going to be, essentially burned at the stake and executed. And she pardoned one because she thought the person was, was a good soul. And so that's some interesting history we have about Nancy Ward. And there's actually in the Cherokee community a group called the Nancy Ward Society. So I see that they're getting ready to have the Cherokee meetings again, the Cherokee holiday back around Labor Day. And if you go to that in Tahlequah, you need to look in the program for when the Nancy Ward Society's meeting. And you can go there, and there'll be a whole group of Nancy Ward descendants, and you can exchange all kinds of information.
Can I ask you a question, Bob?
Yeah.
It's a side issue, but I'm curious about it. The burning at the stake. I have one of my ancestors back in the 1700s was presumably after he had children, and so the line did pass on. He was a Scotch trader, but he was the Cherokees presumably burned him at the stake because he was a quote double agent. I'm just wondering was that a popular form of treating prisoners that you know of?
I don't know. I just had read that they were going to burn this woman at the stake, and Nancy Ward intervened to keep it from happening. So, but I got the idea this wasn't a first time deal.
Yeah, I've just never seen it treated. Was this a common form of punishment by Cherokees? In those early days.
I think it was rare. I think it was rare.
No, I don't know if they picked it up from Cotton Mather and the Salem witch burnings they had.
I think it was limited to very special occasions.
Yeah, you had to be pretty bad to.
Yeah, I don't see mention of it very often.
Yeah, sorry to go off track, but I was just curious about that.
Well, no. So, if anybody has any thoughts or something comes in, feel free to jump in and interrupt. Yeah, because this is for all of us. So, Katie married Ellis Harlan, who was a Quaker from Pennsylvania. And they had a daughter, Nancy Harlan, who, as you can see, was born in 1777, right after the Revolutionary War started. And in 1794, when she was 17, she married Caleb Starr. And that's where the Starr name comes in. That's something to think about, because I'll talk about that in just a minute. So Sarah Walker Starr was born in 1804, died 1892. She was the younger sister of James McMinn Starr, who was born 1796. So you can see he's a little bit older than she was. Died in 1845. He was one of the 27 signatories to the Treaty of Nuechota. And he was assassinated on November 9, 1845 in the Indian Territory. Now, the reason I put that in is I'm going to talk a little bit about the Trail of Tears. And we all know that story, but there's a lot of different stories on the Trail of Tears. And what I'm going to talk about is somewhat more my story, but with the idea that I think everybody, in looking at Cherokee genealogy and your history, ought to the extent you can, figure out where your family was on the Trail of Tears. Because virtually everybody that's a member of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma would have had family that came over on the Trail of Tears. So that was, an interest I had. I'll let you know what I found and give you some clues on how you might be able to find out your connections as well. So Sarah Starr in 1821 married Jesse Mayfield, who lived from 1793 to 1857. And they had one child, Elizabeth Sabina Mayfield. Now, the Treaty of Nuechota was the treaty that essentially signed away the Cherokee lands in the Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee area for a like amount of land in Indian Territory, and then were given, $5 million for moving expenses. And, as everybody knows, extremely controversial. It was only signed by 27 Cherokees. They didn't represent the Cherokee Nation as a whole. In particular, the principal chief, John Ross, did not support the treaty, and he actually campaigned with the U.S. Senate to try and keep it from being ratified. And it was only ratified by one vote in the majority, but it was ratified. And then that precipitated the removal, which started in 1837. So their child, Elizabeth Sabina, would have been 1 year old when she made that journey. Okay, for the Trail of Tears, the Mayfields were in the second group to leave for Oklahoma. They traveled with James Starr, one of the signatories, and I've actually looked at the actual document that was signed. James Starr apparently was not literate in English because he signed by a mark. But he did sign, along with the other famous Cherokees, Major Ridge, John Ridge, Elias Boudinot, Sam Wadey. So James Starr and 365 others were in what was called the B.B. Cannon Detachment, and I've seen it spelled both ways with two N's, like a real cannon and others. So I just put it in this way, but I'll double check that. But they left at the Hiawassee River in Calhoun, Georgia on October 13th, 1837. And they took the northern route, which was the most common route, but at that time, they were the only second ones to take that route, and they arrived in Indian Territory on December 30th. So you can see it took about half of October, all of November, and all of December, so about 2.5 months. to go about 1,000 miles. Now, those of you that are interested in this detachment, there's actually a journal that was kept by B.B. Cannon that's very descriptive of what happened. It talks about what they had to eat, what point they went from, how long it took them to get there, how many miles they traveled, and what happens next. And it also documents the people that died along the way, mainly children. Now this group, since they were part of the treaty party, and the there were three different groups of people that were in the treaty party. In other words, ones that were related to people that signed the treaty that traveled. And then after that, the Cherokees that were not in the treaty party, that didn't want to move and didn't quite understand it, were the ones that were rounded up in the stockades and sent out later. And there's about 10 detachments that went after that. And some of my readings, there's some will say that the first 3 detachments of treaty party members were really not part of the Trail of Tears, because they more or less voluntarily went and were not quite force marched like the others were. On the other hand, they still had to go, and they went the same route and same weather conditions, and they lost people along the way. And I don't know if there's any comparison as to which detachments fared better than the others. They all, I don't think any of them necessarily had a easy sledding of it. But James Mayfield, after he arrived in Indian Territory, he then returned to the Cherokee Nation. And in October 38, he was a wagon master for the Bushy Head Detachment, which was one of the detachments that had people that were on the anti-treaty side of the fence. And I think since he, had gone once, he kind of knew his way. He became a wagon master. The Bushy Head's a famous person in Cherokee history. He was a Baptist preacher. And they would stop every Sunday, and he would give a sermon. And they said people from miles around would come to hear him preach because he was a better preacher than the regular, non-native preachers they had. But he was considered to be, very religious. So Jesse Mayfield, when I was actually researching and doing some things, and I saw Jesse Mayfield being a wagon master, I figured that was the detachment that my ancestors came over. But then when I dug into it deeper, I saw that he actually went with the Cannon detachment and then went back the second time to be a wagon master. So that was a little bit of a twist of things, but it did verify for me as to how my family got from the Cherokee Nation in Georgia to Indian Territory in Oklahoma, and what route they took and what it was like when they got here. Now the next thing that happened is what was called the Starr Wars. And Mary, didn't you say you've got a Starr connection in your family somewhere?
Yes, go all the way up. I was Mary Starr was my great grandmother, but I went all the way up through Caleb Starr yesterday.
Okay.
I'm in the Wolf Clan. I've come all the way down your same lineage, except not the Mayfields.
Yeah. So Caleb Starr had a son named James Starr. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And are you in the direct line of James Starr or one of his siblings?
Let's see. So Caleb, I wrote all this down so I could be I learned a lot yesterday, so now my screen's too big. I can't bring up the document that I did. Here, I've got this. So Mary Starr's parents were James Hickory Starr and Sarah Byers. And then James' parents were Exale Starr, who married Mary Polly Upshaw. And then his parents were Caleb Starr and Nancy Harlem.
Yeah.
That's where I got to so far as of yesterday.
Yeah, that's where I come in too.
Mm-hmm.
Is Nancy Harlan was the daughter of Katie, Catherine, who was Nancy Ward's daughter, and she'd married Ellis Harlan. And so Nancy Harlan marries Caleb Starr, and they've got children. Sarah Walker Starr, who I'm related to, is the one that married Jesse Mayfield, but her brother was James Starr.
There was a Starr, Bean, Exio Starr, yeah, Sarah Walker Starr Mayfield, and George Harlan Starr.
Yeah. So Sarah Walker Starr was the sister of James McMinn Starr, who was born in 1796. And he's the signatory of the Nuechota Treaty. And he traveled on the Cannon Detachment. And after he got to Indian Territory, I need to capitalize Ross, but after he got there, and after everybody got to the Indian Territory, after all the detachments arrived, John Ross's son and others had a secret meeting, and they decided that those that had signed the Treaty of Nuechota, giving away the land, were subject to what they called blood law, which meant that when they signed the treaty, they had signed their death sentence, because no Cherokee was to give away land without authority, and that's what they did. So John Ross's son, they went around and started killing the signatories, including, yeah, so they got some other misspellings I need to fix up, but they killed Major Ridge, John Ridge, Elias Boudinot. They tried to kill Stan Wadey, but he got away. If you remember Samuel Wooster, he was the missionary in the famous case of Wooster versus U.S. Well, he traveled with them, and he was in Indian Territory, and he had a horse named Comet. That was supposedly the fastest horse in the territory, and he told Stan Wadey to take his horse and get away, and he did. Nobody could catch him. But they continued the killings, and they killed James Starr, and they killed James Starr's son, who was disabled. And they were going to kill some of his other kids, other male children. And James Starr's wife was able to wrap him up in her skirts, and so they couldn't get to them. But he had a son named Thomas that was in his 20s, and they didn't get him, but when he found out they had killed his dad and his disabled brother, he got together a group to retaliate, and allegedly over a period of time, they killed 35 of the Ross supporters. And it wasn't all in one time, but these were back and forth killings. And if you read in the Cherokee Advocate, it'll talk about, what's going on about the Starrs and the killings, and some kind of referred to it as the Starr Wars. But there got to be a real back and forth. It's almost like a Sicilian bloodletting. And that continued through the 1840s until President Polk called both sides to D.C. and said he didn't really know or really didn't care who started it, but he said it's going to stop, and it's going to stop today. Anybody that's killed anybody up to this date has got a presidential pardon. But anybody that kills anybody tomorrow will be subject to prosecution. And surprisingly, both sides stopped the killings, and then they referred to the period of time afterward as the golden years. It lasted until the Civil War, where they all got along, they cooperated, they did things and progressed. But during that time, my family and a number of others decided that there was too much bloodshed going on back and forth. This was before the pardon, and they moved to Texas, in East Texas, to Rusk County. And there had been a group of Cherokees there, known as the Cherokee, and you can see the Texas Cherokees, and their chief was Chief Bowles. And Chief Bowles had left earlier in the 1820s and had settled in Texas, but became friends with Sam Houston and were allies with the Texans in the Mexican War. And their job was, when the Texans were fighting the Mexicans had allied with some of the Plains tribes that were going to attack the Texans from the rear, and Chief Bowles and the Texas Cherokees said they would provide the rear guard to keep the Plains Indians from getting the Texans, so they could prevail. And in exchange for that, they were going to, Sam Houston promised them, essentially 3 counties in the state of Texas around Nacogdoches, which is in East Texas. And Rusk County was one of them. But the problem was Sam Houston got elected to the Senate. He wasn't governor any longer, and Texas became a state, and Lamar didn't uphold the bargain and organized a group of Texas Rangers that essentially slaughtered a lot of the Texas Cherokees, including Chief Bowles. But there's a memorial to Chief Bowles that's in that area. But this all happened before my ancestors moved over to Texas, but that's the area they settled up with because there were still Texas Cherokees there. But I thought that was an interesting story because I've always wondered how my family got from Oklahoma to Texas and then back to Oklahoma. The Mayfields had a daughter, Elizabeth. She married a doctor named George William White. Gosh, I didn't proofread this, so you can see I missed some spellings there. And had a daughter, Jessie Coral White, born in 1860. Yeah.
I have a map of Texas in 1836, and it shows the location of the Cherokee villages at the time.
And is it in that eastern part of Texas?
Yeah, it's all kind of north of Nacogdoches.
Yeah.
We have some family land not that far from it.
Well, that was probably, was that your Cherokee family or?
No, it was my mother's side.
Okay. Yeah, let's see if I can get this map. This is that area.
This map that I have was actually drawn by Stephen F. Austin.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, it's a copy of it, of his original.
Anyway, it's an interesting story about here's maybe a better map of that area. And you can see in gray is where the Texas Cherokees were.
And what book is that from?
It's Chief Bowles and the Texas Cherokees.
Okay. Yeah, I have that one.
And I see Bowles spelled with an E and without an E. And if you'll bear with me for a minute, I'm going to read a little bit from an interview with Jesse Mayfield's grandson that was taken on March 19th, 1937. And I think, Joe, you've referred to some of these things before where you've got somebody that's given one of those oral histories. This is the deal where a person was a grandson. He was interviewed by a historical Indian research worker. And I'll just give a part of it, but he says he's 1/4 Cherokee, born 1852 in Tyler, Texas. He's 85 years old when he gives this version. His mother name was Nancy Mayfield. His grandfather was Jesse Mayfield, who was born in North Carolina and was buried at Bellevue, Texas. He had a grandmother, Sally Starr Mayfield, who's Sally and Sarah, kind of interchangeable names. He was also buried in Bellevue, Texas. And he says grandmother, when about 12 years of age, went to the river to see the party under Chief Bowles, who was chief of a band of Cherokee Indians, digging in canoes, seeking a new land in which to live. Chief Bowles and his party drifted down the Tennessee River until they came to the Mississippi River. And then they reached the mouth of the Red River, and then they went up the Red River to the mouth of the Sabine River, to the headwaters of the Neches River, and established a village there. It says he remained there until the Mexican War. At the beginning of the Mexican War, with the solicitation of Sam Houston, an agreement was made whereby Chief Bowles would protect their rear from attack from wild Indians. The reason that he solicited Chief Bowles was because he lived with the Indians and knew their traits, character, and tactics. For his services as such, he was promised a concession of land which embraced 3 counties, Rusk, Smith, and Cherokee County. He goes on to say the result of the Mexican War was that the United States whipped them. But Chief Bowles never did receive his reward, the 3 counties promised. And it says that Lamar came up to Chief Bowles and told him that the boundary of Texas is marked by the sword. Bowles was killed by the Texas Rangers and the larger part of his tribe slaughtered. Said some got away, and they took them as prisoners to Fort Townsend in Indian Territory, then to Fort Smith, turned back over the Cherokee Nation. He said his mother, through an instigation of the treaty, that's Treaty of Nuechota, went on the Trail of Tears. They traveled in caravans and wagons and were pushed along by the U.S. troops. Many of the Cherokees did not care to leave their lands that were so productive, and also to leave behind the burial grounds where their loved ones were buried, to come to this western country. It was forced upon them, and consequently a great deal of dissatisfaction reigned among them, causing a faction known as the Treaty Party and the Anti-Treaty Party. My mother told me they came to the Mississippi River, this is on the Trail of Tears, that it was up, and it was necessary for them to remain there 6 or 7 weeks before they could cross the river, as they had no means other than canoes and flatboats to put them across. This put them on the west bank of the Mississippi River in Arkansas, and then they continued, said a lot of them died on the banks from dysentery, and they were buried in unmarked graves. And my mother was one of the fortunates that made it through, and it's useless to say that she endured many hardships, was grief-stricken and sorrowful. She weathered the storm, while others, even after arriving, soon died of sorrow and grief. In this removal, my grandfather had 30 teams and was employed by the government to assist in removing them. So I guess my folks really fared well to what some of the rest of them did, because they brought with them enough stuff to start building cabins, clearing the land, and making ready for crops. So I think he didn't quite understand that there were 2 trips, that there was one his grandmother was on with his grandfather, and then there's another one that his grandfather was on. And he says his mother and father were married in the Cherokee Nation and remained there until what they call the Starr War between the parties of treaty and anti-treaty. My parents, along with Judge Adair, George Starr, Judge Wiley, Franklin D. Thompson, 2 or 3 of my uncles, and my grandmother, Sally Mayfield, all went to Texas before the Civil War and lived as one big family and located near the present town of Tyler in Kilgore, and that's where I was born. Because we didn't return to the Indian Territory till 1888. So during my Civil War, his father volunteered, but he was over age and fought under the Confederate flag, but was never involved in any battle. He said, prior to the war, my parents and grandparents owned many slaves, and naturally, when the slaves were freed, it left us very much humiliated from a financial standpoint. All we had was land. We started farming, then by employing Negroes and doing the best we could under the circumstances with free Negro labor, and it was really bad. I think he means without free Negro labor. Our principal crops were cotton, corn, and raising cattle. I would say that my father was left in debt after the war to the extent of $300,000. I mean by that the war cost him $300,000. Yes, I don't know quite how I came up with his figures, but I think it's kind of an interesting story that he tells, and it's sort of the first-hand knowledge. But it was there that Elizabeth Mayfield married my great-grandmother. Well, anyway, Elizabeth Mayfield didn't marry my great-great-grandfather, George William White. He was a doctor from Tulane, and they had a daughter, Jessie Cora White. And my son, Eric, that's where you get your middle name, White. Jessie Cora White, born 1860, right before the Civil War, died in 1953 in Claremore. And she gave birth to my grandfather, White Murphy, was born 1892 in Rusk County and died in 1967 in Stillwater. So that kind of brings it to my story. I mean, my father was born in Stillwater. I was born in Stillwater. All my children were born in Stillwater. But I was married in Aberdeen, Washington, and we live now in Spokane.